In the previous session, we looked at the mapping of a bidirectional one-to-many relationship. But what if we wanted to map a unidirectional one-to-many relationship? How do we do that? Well, that's what we'll look at in this session. And while doing that, we will also see that why we should always avoid using it, because otherwise it could cost us with some performance in our application. Okay, so here is the bidirectional one-to-many relationship that we looked at in the last session. This mapped by attribute here, which is the required attribute for a bidirectional mapping, was telling us that the one-to-many bidirectional mapping here between the guide and student entity is mapped by this guide here, which is an attribute on the other side of the relationship, and is mapped to the foreign key column using a join column annotation. So this foreign key column here and the guide attribute mapped to it is what's making this bidirectional mapping work. Now we call it a bidirectional relationship because each side in the relationship could navigate to the other side. But once we make it a unidirectional relationship, only a guide would be able to navigate to its associated students, and a student will know nothing about its associated guide, as it won't be able to navigate to it. And all we have to do to make that happen, to convert this relationship from the bidirectional one-to-many to a unidirectional one-to-many, is remove this mapped by attribute here, which is a requirement only for a bidirectional mapping. And along with that, we have to remove everything associated with this guide attribute here as well, as that's what the value of the mapped by attribute here is pointing to. So we'll also have to remove the guide attribute from the student entity, along with all the metadata that it's annotated with. And that's all you need to do to make it a unidirectional relationship, as a student cannot navigate to its associated guide anymore. Only a guide knows about its associated students. So this is how you map the unidirectional guide to student one-to-many relationship. We do not need a mapped by attribute in a unidirectional relationship. And here are the tables that our unidirectional mapping here will generate for you through Hibernate. It will use a join table to implement our unidirectional mapping here. In this join table, we have two columns, and both of them are a foreign key column. The guide underscore ID column here is the foreign key of the guide table, and the students underscore ID here is the foreign key of the student table. And please note that it's students underscore ID, not student underscore ID. Students with an S at the end of it. And that's because it's mapped to the students attribute in the guide entity. The way Hibernate makes this join table implement the unidirectional one-to-many is by adding in this students underscore ID column here a unique constraint to avoid a duplicate student entry for a particular guide in it. So that's how Hibernate makes it work for a unidirectional one-to-many relationship. Now, if you want to customize the naming of this join table here, you could do that. But we don't want to do that here. We'll do that later when we talk about the many-to-many relationship. The reason why we don't want to do it here is because shortly we will see that unidirectional one-to-many is a bad idea, and we should always avoid it, as it's not good from the performance perspective. We should always prefer the bidirectional one-to-many relationship. So this join table here is what you get by default when you map your one-to-many relationship as a unidirectional relationship. So with a bidirectional one-to-many, we get this foreign key column, and with a unidirectional one-to-many, we get a join table. Which means that with this unidirectional mapping here, we get an extra table. And we'll see shortly that because of this extra table here, we'll be needing extra inserts and join statements, which would not be required in a bidirectional mapping. Now let's go ahead and persist some data. So here is the more complete look of our student entity and the guide entity. The student entity here has the ID, name, and enrollment ID data attributes, and the guide here has the ID, name, staff ID, and salary data attributes. And this student here is the collection of students being guided by a particular guide object. And we are using this add student method here to add a student to a guide student collection, and the remove student method to remove a student from that collection. And we are cascading the persist operation here. So we'll be using this unidirectional one-to-many relationship here to persist our data. And here is the test class in which we'll be persisting a guide object along with two of its students. We are creating a guide object on line 8 here, and then on line 10 and 11, we are creating two students, the student 1 and student 2. And then we are adding them to the guide student collection on line 13 and 14. And then finally, we are persisting the guide on line 16. So once the guide object gets persisted, these are the SQL statements that will be issued for it. And here is what the database tables are going to look like. So to persist a guide object along with two of its associated students, we'll get issued these 5 insert statements here. The first insert is inserting the guide object to the guide table, and the next 2 inserts are inserting the associated student objects into the student table. And then these final 2 inserts here are inserting the foreign key values into the join table. So with the unidirectional one-to-many, we've got these 5 SQL inserts for persisting a guide with 2 of its students. But if we were using the bidirectional one-to-many to persist the same data, then we would have needed just 3 of these insert statements. We would not have needed the last 2 statements here, as we do not have a join table with a bidirectional one-to-many. So with unidirectional one-to-many, we are getting 2 extra insert statements that we would not have needed with the bidirectional one-to-many, which is not good from the performance perspective. Okay, so that's for persisting a guide. Now let's go ahead and update a guide. So in this client class here, we are updating a guide by adding a new student under its guidance. And we are assuming this here to be the current state of the guide table, student table, and the join table. So on line 7 here, we are loading the guide with ID 1, and then in the next line, we are creating a new student. And then we are adding it to the guide student collection. And then we are persisting our guide on line 11. And here is the SQL that will get issued for it. We'll have 4 statements issued for updating a guide with a new student, which will create a new entry in the student table and also in the join table. But if we were using the bidirectional one-to-many, we would have got just 3 of these statements issued. We would not have issued this insert here to insert the foreign key values into the join table, and we would not have got this inner join here either. And in case you have no understanding of SQL joins, just know that if there is one thing you want to minimize to help the performance of your application, is that you should minimize any extra or unnecessary SQL joins in your statements. So clearly, the unidirectional one-to-many is not doing us any good from the performance perspective. Now, I want to mention here that when you try the provided source code for this session, try to create a separate database for it and not use the Hello World database that we've been using so far. It's good to do that sometimes, particularly when you're experimenting with the provided source code and trying new things with it. So in this session, we are going to create this Uni one-to-many database. You just have to right-click and then follow the instructions. Yeah, quite simple. So now that we've got our database created, just go ahead and run this persisting a guide client. So when we do that, we'll get the same results that we saw a while ago. And we should have the database created for us and all the tables inside it also populated for us. Yeah, we could see here that here is the guides underscore student table, here is the student table, and here is the guide table. And if we look at the console here, we should be seeing 5 insert statements here. Yeah. And now let's go ahead and update our guide. So just go ahead and run it. It's the same code that we saw earlier. And we should be seeing this extra insert here, as we discussed earlier, and the inner join here as well. And in our database, we should see a new student, yeah, and also, yeah, this join table updated for us. So again, we should always try to avoid the unidirectional one-to-many and prefer the bidirectional one-to-many.